Arrogant politician insults. Black judge in court. What happens next leaves the entire room frozen. The smell of ash still clung to the wind like a curse that refused to lift. Smoke hung low over what used to be the heart of Silver Grove, a neighborhood now reduced to blackened skeletons of homes and dreams. Cracked picture frames lay shattered in the dirt, their glass melted by fire, the faces inside barely recognizable. A woman knelt on the scorched remains of her porch, her hands trembling as she picked through the debris with blistered fingers. Somewhere beneath the rubble, she believed, was her mother's wedding ring. She had nothing left but that hope. Down the street, a 10-year-old boy stood motionless beside the carcass of what used to be his bedroom. His face was streaked with soot and silent tears. In his hands, he clutched the leg of a half-burnt stuffed bear, its eyes melted, one ear gone. He didn't scream or speak. He just held the ruined toy to his chest like it might bring back everything he'd lost. Behind him, his father kicked through broken tiles and twisted metal, calling out a name he already knew wouldn't answer. People moved like ghosts, slow, aimless, hollow. The fire had taken everything. And it wasn't just the flames that destroyed their lives. It was what came after. Silence. Insurance companies citing fine print. Emergency funds mysteriously delayed. No officials on the ground. No answers. Just microphones and cameras. On every TV screen, Senator Patrick Langford's face appeared, perfectly composed, perfectly rehearsed. He stood at a gleaming podium, wrapped in the American flag, eyes glassy with fabricated concern. "This tragedy," he said, his voice rich and solemn, "has shaken me deeply. My heart goes out to every family suffering loss. We will rebuild, together." But the people of Silver Grove weren't buying it. They'd seen the leaked reports, the maintenance logs showing that the power lines hadn't been inspected in 6 years, the emails suggesting Langford had blocked infrastructure upgrades in exchange for campaign contributions, and then just days after the flames, those same lands, still smoldering, had been quietly purchased by shell companies tied to Langford's inner circle. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a setup, a sacrifice, and they were the offering. At the heart of the fury stood one man who hadn't asked to be a hero, Judge Elias Monroe. He didn't know it yet, but he had just been assigned the class action lawsuit against Langford and the East Dominion Energy Corporation. He didn't know that this case would make him a target. He didn't know that every skeleton in his past would be dragged into the light, that every ally would be questioned, and that the robe he wore, black, dignified, once a symbol of justice, would become a target for those who viewed the law as something to buy, bend, or bury. He only knew what he could see, a thick file folder resting on the edge of his desk. Case number F2831, Silver Grove v. Langford et al. Outside, the media circled like vultures. Reporters shouted questions through courthouse gates. Protesters flooded the steps, holding up scorched photos, burned insurance policies, and handmade signs with words like "blood for profit" and "justice can't be bought." Elias sat alone in courtroom 4. The lights above him dimmed. The room felt colder than usual, like the weight of history had decided to settle here and now. He reached for the file, opened it slowly. The first thing inside wasn't legal text or case law. It was a photo, a drone shot taken 2 days after the fire. Rows of houses turned to ash. Children sitting on sidewalk curbs, barefoot and blank-eyed. His fingers trembled, just for a second. The next page was a witness list, over 300 names. He scanned the first few. Maria Delgado, age 67, lost her home and husband. Levi Armstrong, 12, now blind in one eye from smoke inhalation. Tara Wilkins, 6 months pregnant, miscarried in the shelter days later. He closed the folder, his jaw clenched, his breath held. This wasn't just a case. This wasn't business as usual. This was war, waged not with bombs or bullets, but with silence, policy, and the slow grinding gears of institutional betrayal. He looked up at the bench before him, the same one he had presided from for 17 years. It had never felt so far away. Justice had always been an uphill battle, but this wasn't uphill. This was vertical, a wall built of power, wealth, and corruption, so thick it choked the truth before it could breathe. From outside the courtroom windows, the sound of chanting rose like a wave. "We want justice! We want justice!" Elias didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply sat in that worn leather chair, staring at the mountain of files that represented lives burned to the ground. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of the judge's bench. Not the man the public knew, not the composed figure of law and order, but a tired black man facing a tidal wave designed to drown him. And still he didn't look away. Behind him, in the shadows of courtroom 4, sat a stack of mail. Hundreds of letters from victims begging for help. Some typed, most handwritten, many tear-stained, all desperate. "Please, Your Honor," one read, "don't let him get away with it." He wouldn't. Elias Monroe was not a politician. He was not a celebrity. He had no army of consultants, no publicists, no donors. What he had was a belief, beaten into him from childhood, that the law meant something, that justice, real, painful, costly justice, was worth fighting for, even if it came at the price of everything else. But before Elias Monroe ever wore the robe of a federal judge, before his name commanded silence in courtrooms, there was a night that would shape his entire life. A night of injustice so raw, so personal, that it would carve itself into his bones forever. The screams didn't come first. What came first was the silence, thick, suffocating, unnatural. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around the bones and crushed the lungs. 10-year-old Elias Monroe sat on the faded blue couch, legs too short to touch the floor, his homework open in his lap, though he hadn't written a word in over an hour. His father, Samuel Monroe, stood in the kitchen, making coffee with that soft whistle he always did when he thought no one was listening. Outside, the sun had just dipped below the rooftops of their working-class neighborhood, casting long, golden shadows across the hardwood floor. And then came the knock. Not a polite knock, not a neighbor's knock, a government knock. It rattled the entire apartment like thunder made of fists. His mother froze mid-step. His father stopped whistling. Elias felt the chill of something ancient run down his spine. The second knock came louder. By the third, the door burst open before anyone could answer. They didn't wait for permission. Men in dark vests and guns drawn spilled into the hallway like a SWAT-flavored flood. Barking orders, pointing fingers, grabbing wrists. "Samuel Monroe, on the ground, now!" his mother screamed. His father dropped the coffee pot, shattering it across the tile floor. Elias jumped to his feet, but a hand, gloved, rough, pushed him back down. "Stay there, kid." The voice was cold, robotic. Samuel didn't resist. He knelt, hands above his head, voice calm. "You've got the wrong person." But calm meant nothing. Truth meant nothing. Elias watched, wide-eyed and frozen, as zip ties replaced handcuffs, as knees dug into his father's back, as flashlights illuminated every crevice of their home like it was a crime scene. "What's happening?" Elias finally shouted. "Why are you taking him?" No one answered. One officer muttered, "Wire fraud, embezzlement, bribery." Words Elias didn't yet understand, but would never forget. Words that became curses in his nightmares. As they dragged his father away, Elias ran forward, clutching the leg of his dad's worn khakis. "He didn't do anything! He didn't do anything!" Samuel turned his head, his face bleeding from a gash above his eyebrow. "I love you, son," he whispered, and then he was gone. The door slammed behind them. The silence returned, but now it screamed. It took 7 months for the trial. Elias sat through every day of it. His mother wore her best dress, even when she couldn't afford to eat. They watched as prosecutors presented doctored spreadsheets and manipulated emails, all conveniently pulled from a company Samuel had never worked for. Witnesses were brought in, paid, rehearsed, and sharp. Every time Samuel opened his mouth, objections flew. Every time he tried to explain, the judge looked bored. It was over before it began. Guilty on all counts. Elias would never forget the moment the gavel dropped. It didn't sound like wood on wood. It sounded like a tomb sealing shut. Samuel Monroe was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. No parole, no mercy, no justice. They moved out of the apartment a month later. Couldn't afford rent, couldn't afford groceries. Elias stopped bringing lunch to school. Kids whispered behind his back, "Isn't his dad in jail?" Teachers looked at him like he might become the next one. He stopped smiling. He stopped speaking. But he started watching. Watching how judges spoke in courtrooms. Watching how attorneys twisted language like knives. Watching how the law, this thing he had once believed in, was a weapon aimed at the defenseless. And he made a promise. "I'll never let them do this to anyone else." Years passed. Elias buried himself in books, in codes, in statutes. While other kids were playing ball or chasing girls, he was reading the Constitution under a flickering streetlight. He graduated valedictorian, won scholarships no one thought he could earn, and walked into Harvard Law wearing a thrift store suit and a fire no storm could extinguish. But even as he rose, top of his class, editor of the Law Review, youngest clerk in the D.C. Circuit, he never forgot. The law he'd learned was not inherently just. It was merely a tool, a sword in the hand of whoever wielded it loudest. He saw classmates with trust funds and last names that opened doors like passwords. He saw judges play golf with CEOs they'd later rule in favor of. He saw prosecutors high-five each other after cutting deals that destroyed lives. He never high-fived. He never smiled after a ruling. He simply worked, quiet and relentless, sharpening his understanding of every loophole, every precedent, every line of fine print used to crush the voiceless. When he was appointed as a federal judge at 42, the youngest black judge in his district, some newspapers called it historic. Others called it suspicious. "Diversity hire," one columnist wrote. Elias didn't respond. He just got to work. He ruled with iron logic, undeniable evidence, and a stare that turned lies into dust. His courtroom became known as the Last Wall, a place where no favor, no donation, no family name could tip the scales. But for all his rulings, for all his victories, one ghost never left him: his father. Samuel Monroe died in prison 7 months before Elias was appointed. Pneumonia, poor treatment. They didn't even call in time for Elias to say goodbye. The system never apologized, never admitted wrong, never made it right. And that was the scar that never healed. Now, as Elias sat in his chambers, the Silver Grove case file on his desk, he knew exactly what this moment was. Not a trial, not a hearing, not even a reckoning. It was a return. The same machine that devoured his father had come again. Bigger, wealthier, meaner. And this time, it had new victims, new lies, new flames. But Elias wasn't 10 years old anymore, and he wasn't crying on the floor of a ransacked living room. He was the judge now, and they had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Elias had spent a lifetime preparing to fight injustice from the bench, but nothing could prepare him for the war unfolding in the Silver Grove case. Inside the courtroom, the Silver Grove class action trial had turned from a legal battle into a battlefield soaked in shadows. What was supposed to be a clear-cut case of corporate negligence had mutated into a labyrinth of smoke and mirrors. Each piece of evidence Elias Monroe touched felt like it had been dipped in acid, corroded, tampered with, fake. The engineering reports, forged. Not once, not by mistake, but systematically, surgically. Every inspection log showing years of failing infrastructure, replaced with pristine PDFs that claimed no critical issues found. Digital timestamps had been backdated, signatures replicated. The power company's internal servers had been wiped clean, then repopulated with pre-approved narratives. And the whistleblowers? Gone. One had moved out of state overnight, leaving behind an empty apartment and unpaid rent. Another recanted their entire statement in court, trembling as they spoke, eyes darting to the back of the room as if someone were waiting. A third, an intern who had emailed photos of corroded lines to local journalists, was found unconscious in a motel room. Official report, overdose. Elias had read the file. Something about it didn't sit right. Nothing did. Outside the courthouse, the war had shifted. Senator Patrick Langford, the man at the center of the corruption, was no longer just fighting for exoneration. He was fighting to bury Elias Monroe. Not through motions or legal arguments, through media. It started with whispers, then headlines. Judge Monroe's bias under fire. Can a man with a personal grudge deliver impartial justice? Critics question competence of youngest black federal judge. Langford's press machine had found its rhythm. Slick, ruthless, and well-funded. Overnight, Elias's background was dissected on talk shows. They pulled yearbook photos, misquoted law school lectures, twisted old speeches into radical rhetoric. One panelist on national TV declared, "This judge clearly has a chip on his shoulder. He's making this personal. We need a senior, experienced judge, not a diversity hire with an axe to grind." Another chimed in, "When you give a case this big to someone who looks like he's still auditioning for a courtroom drama, what do you expect?" The attacks were relentless. Anonymous letters arrived at the courthouse. One included a photo of Elias's childhood home with a red X over it. Protesters began gathering outside his chambers, holding signs that read, "Monroe equals agenda," and "We want justice, not revenge." Behind closed doors, defense attorneys began referring to him not as "Your Honor," but as the activist in robes. Still, Elias said nothing. He didn't rebut the media. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't threaten countersuits or demand apologies. Instead, he worked. He worked while the world tried to break him. It was past midnight when Elias sat alone in his office, the courthouse silent, the halls long emptied. Rain lashed against the tall windows, and thunder grumbled in the distance like the growl of something ancient. The desk lamp cast a harsh glow across pages, scattered like the wreckage of a storm. Deposition transcripts, motion filings, forensic reports, and hundreds of handwritten letters from Silver Grove victims begging the court not to forget them. In the center of it all sat the morning's newspaper. Front page, full-color photo, a picture of Elias at the bench, edited to look dark, grim, and out of place. The headline screamed, "Judge Monroe too emotional to handle case." Below it, the article hinted at everything Langford had whispered behind closed doors, that Elias's father's wrongful conviction made him unfit, that his decisions were motivated by vengeance, not law. That justice had no room for bias, especially from a black man with baggage. Elias stared at the article for a long time. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just read every word, every accusation, every insinuation. Then, with a calmness colder than steel, he folded the paper once, twice, and slid it into a drawer. It made no sound, no anger, no comment, no defense, just silence. And then he picked up his pen. His hand moved with measured certainty, writing the opening lines of a draft that would become one of the most powerful judicial rulings in modern legal history. The words poured from a place deeper than memory, sharper than experience. They came from every injustice he'd witnessed, every lie the system had allowed, every child like him watching their parent dragged away without cause. Elias wasn't just writing a decision. He was writing a reckoning. He quoted statutes and legal precedents, yes, but he also quoted pain. He referenced ignored warnings, silenced experts, and faked reports. He dismantled the power company's narrative piece by piece, exposing the coordinated fraud like a surgeon peeling back skin to reveal rot beneath. Each line was a blade, each paragraph a torch, and still, even in the heat of his fury, he never let it consume the law. He stayed within its lines, tight, focused, ironclad. He left no room for appeal, no cracks for corruption to crawl back through. Behind him, the city slept. But Elias didn't. He couldn't. He knew what was at stake. He knew Langford wanted a mistrial, wanted him to snap, to scream, to walk into that courtroom and make it about race, revenge, or righteousness. But Elias would not give him that satisfaction. He would give him something worse, judgment. Outside the window, the rain slowed. The clouds began to break. Light, dim but pure, started to pierce the night sky. And inside courtroom 4, Judge Elias Monroe kept writing, his face calm, his eyes blazing, and the fire inside him refusing to die. Just as Elias began uncovering the cracks in Silver Grove's corporate facade, the full weight of retaliation came crashing down. Evidence vanished, witnesses went silent, and the fight for justice turned personal. Deadly personal. The walls were closing in, and Elias Monroe could feel it with every breath. What started as a case about negligence had turned into a crucible of power and fear. The deeper Elias pushed into the Silver Grove file, the more vicious the resistance became. It wasn't just legal maneuvering anymore. It was sabotage. It was psychological warfare. It began with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. The line was silent at first, nothing but static. Elias had already been awake, hunched over his desk, red ink bleeding across pages of notes. Then finally a voice, low, mechanical, untraceable. "Stop digging, or you won't be the only one who pays." Click. That same day, his wife Marie found a man sitting in a car across the street from their home. He wasn't holding a camera, but the message was clear. That night, when their son left basketball practice, he called Elias in a panic. "Dad, I think someone's following me." The threats weren't subtle anymore, and they weren't just coming for Elias. They were circling the people he loved. Meanwhile, one man still had the power to expose everything. Daniel Kerr, a former technician from East Dominion Power. Kerr had come forward quietly, handing off internal documents that proved the company had been warned repeatedly about faulty transformers and failing lines in Silver Grove. His testimony would blow the case wide open. He was scheduled to take the stand within a week, but 2 nights before his deposition, he disappeared. For 24 hours, no one could reach him. His phone went straight to voicemail. His email auto-replied with a family emergency message. Then, without warning, he resurfaced, standing at his front door with a bruised lip and shaking hands. He told reporters it had all been a misunderstanding. Elias knew better. Kerr had been silenced. Privately, Kerr admitted to Elias that his family had been followed, his daughter approached at school, his wife cornered in a grocery store parking lot. "They said if I testified," Kerr whispered, "we'd all disappear." He couldn't go through with it. Elias didn't blame him, but it didn't make the sting any less sharp. Then came the next strike, this time aimed squarely at Elias's credibility. An anonymous source leaked a series of documents to the media, emails, wire transfers, and photos that allegedly linked Elias to lobbying groups and private law firms. The narrative was explosive. Judge Monroe had accepted gifts, influence, and backdoor favors from legal coalitions connected to the plaintiffs. It was all fake, every last document. But the damage was instant. Headlines lit up. Conflict of interest? Monroe under fire for secret lobbyist ties. Scandal rocks, Silver Grove trial. Judge accused of backroom deals. TV pundits began to circle like sharks in bloodied water. One panel questioned whether Elias had compromised the integrity of the bench. Another outright called for a mistrial. The senator's PR machine didn't need to attack directly. They simply nudged the narrative and let public opinion do the rest. It worked. The community began to fracture. Outside the courthouse, protests were no longer unified. One side carried signs that read, "Stand with Monroe and truth over power." The other side, "Fake judge, bought and paid for. Impeach him now." And for the first time, Elias saw uncertainty in the eyes of the people who once believed in him. It cut deeper than any article ever could. He stopped sleeping. Nights became long, slow battles with doubt and silence. His desk became a war zone of legal texts and printouts. His coat never left the back of his chair. The shadows under his eyes deepened until they looked bruised. He drank coffee that had gone cold 3 hours earlier, wrote legal arguments until his pen ran dry, and still felt the walls tightening. He questioned everything. Was he doing the right thing? Was justice even possible when the machine was this well-oiled, this ruthless? He had stared down corrupt attorneys, biased juries, and political pressure before. But this was different. This was a slow suffocation. Every time he reached for the truth, another piece of it slipped through rigged systems, media spin, or manufactured doubt. And yet, he didn't stop. One night around 2 a.m., he received an envelope slipped under his chamber door. No return address. Inside, 2 photographs. One of his wife, Marie, locking the front door of their home. The other, his son, at the bus stop, headphones in, head down. The message was clear. His hands trembled as he set the photos down. He didn't speak, didn't shout. He just sat there staring into the dim light, his pulse thudding in his ears like distant gunfire. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a warning. "Stop, or we break your world." But Elias had already lost too much to fear. He had lost his father to a system that bent to power. He had lost faith in comfort. And now, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant putting his entire life at risk, he would not let truth die quietly. So he returned to his desk. The draft ruling sat in front of him, half-written, filled with facts that had been fought for, clawed out of buried documents, salvaged from corrupted files. Every word he wrote was a shield for those who could no longer speak. Residents of Silver Grove, whistleblowers like Kerr, even himself. He didn't know if he would survive the fire that was coming, but he knew what he owed to the truth. He picked up his pen and kept writing. But they didn't just want him off the case. They wanted him erased. The petition came in the form of a crisp envelope, stamped with the seal of the Senate Judiciary Oversight Committee. But Elias Monroe didn't need to open it to know what it said. The signature on the cover page belonged to Senator Patrick Langford himself, the man whose empire of lies had turned Silver Grove into ash. And now, with his legal defenses cracking, Langford was playing his final card, a calculated attack on the one man standing between him and escape. The Honorable Elias Monroe, the petition read, demonstrates a pattern of personal bias, inflammatory rulings, and possible conflicts of interest that compromise his ability to preside over the Silver Grove proceedings with the impartiality required of a federal judge. It was a lie, every word, but it didn't matter. Within 24 hours, the Judicial Review Committee voted to temporarily suspend Elias Monroe, pending a full investigation into his conduct. No ruling, no defense, just silence. His courtroom was locked, his nameplate removed. The gavel he had wielded in pursuit of justice now sat cold and untouched in a sealed chamber. For the first time in over a decade, Elias didn't walk into the courthouse at dawn. Instead, he stood on the sidewalk in front of it, watching as security guards posted a temporarily closed sign across the courthouse doors. The halls where he once demanded truth had fallen mute, drowned out by bureaucracy, fear, and political power. The message was clear: back down, disappear, or be destroyed. Inside his chest, something twisted and burned. Not anger, not sorrow, but something heavier. The weight of betrayal, the sense of justice slipping further from reach. But Silver Grove hadn't forgotten him. That night, long after dusk fell and the news anchors gleefully dissected his suspension, something unexpected stirred outside Elias's home. First it was one family, then 3, then 10. They came quietly, carrying candles and flashlights, some with homemade signs, others with tears in their eyes. There were mothers holding photos of their burned homes, elderly couples wrapped in blankets, their retirement savings gone in the fire. Teenagers clutching posters that read, "We still believe in Judge Monroe." Soon the sidewalk outside his modest house glowed in flickering candlelight. No chants, no microphones, just silent defiance. A vigil for the judge they trusted. A protest against the system trying to silence him. Elias watched from behind the curtain at first, stunned. In a world so quick to turn away, these people had come not to ask, but to stand. And among them was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with soot-stained sneakers and eyes too old for his age. Elias remembered him, not his name, but his face, from the first week of the trial. He'd testified about how his bedroom had caught fire while he was drawing pictures of astronauts. His voice had cracked when he said, "I couldn't save my toy." Now the boy stood in front of Elias's gate, holding something small and crumpled in his hands. His mother gave him a gentle nudge. Elias stepped outside. The crowd fell silent. The boy walked up slowly and extended his hand. It was the charred remains of a stuffed bear. Its fur was singed black. One eye had melted, but it had been stitched back together, clumsily with thick white thread. "This was my favorite," the boy said, looking up. "It almost didn't make it, but I fixed it, 'cause I believe it still matters." Elias swallowed hard. The boy pressed the bear into his hand. "You're like this bear, I think, burned a little, but not broken. I know you'll do what's right." It took everything Elias had not to break down. He nodded once, his jaw clenched too tight for words. The boy smiled and turned back toward the crowd. Elias stood there, the weight of the scorched bear in his hand, heavier than any gavel he had ever lifted. Back inside, the silence felt different now. Not hollow, but loaded. Waiting. He walked into his study and sat at the desk, where just days ago he had been finalizing the draft of his ruling, a ruling he had never been allowed to issue. His laptop was still open, the screen dark from inactivity. Next to it, the framed photo of his wife and son stared back at him. And beyond that, his gavel. He reached for it, ran his fingers along the polished wood. This wasn't over. They had taken his courtroom. They had smeared his name. They had twisted public opinion and tried to blackmail him into silence. But they had made one mistake. They thought justice only lived in buildings. They thought Elias Monroe was a title, not a fire that refused to die. He stood again, this time not as a judge, not even as a man under investigation, but as a symbol of what couldn't be bought, silenced, or buried. And in his heart, something reignited. It wasn't vengeance, it was purpose. Because somewhere out there, children like that boy still believed the system could work, still believed men like Elias Monroe could protect them. And he couldn't let that belief burn with everything else. He picked up the bear, set it beside the gavel, and whispered, "I'm not done. Not even close. The fight for justice is just beginning." More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The courtroom was closed, the title stripped, the gavel silenced. But Elias Monroe had never been more dangerous. Suspension didn't stop him. It freed him. They had pushed him outside the system, thinking he would disappear. But in the shadows, without protocols to bind his hands, Elias became something else, a quiet reckoning. By day, he stayed indoors, a ghost judge in a quiet house, the media cycle spinning lies and rumors just outside his door. But by night, he made calls, secure lines, encrypted apps, meetings in cars parked beneath overpasses. He wasn't reaching for the law anymore. He was reaching for the truth, no matter how far it had been buried. And the first person to believe in him, not because she had to, but because she saw what others refused to, was a young reporter named Kara Lynn. She wasn't from any major network. She wasn't rich, connected, or protected. But she had something far more dangerous: integrity. She had covered the Silver Grove fires early on, before the spin, before the consultants, before Langford's team flooded the headlines. Elias had noticed her in the crowd outside his home during the candlelight vigil. She hadn't held a sign. She'd held a camera and a notepad, and eyes that didn't look away when the truth got ugly. Kara met Elias in a parking garage at 2 a.m. She wore a hoodie. He wore a baseball cap. It wasn't just precaution. It was survival. "I need access," she said. "Internal emails, transfers, anything they're hiding." "They're hiding everything," Elias replied. And then he handed her the first breadcrumb, a series of redacted contracts between the State Utilities Commission and East Dominion Energy, dated 6 months before the Silver Grove fires. It wasn't much, but the language was vague, the dates suspicious, and the signatures matched Langford's inner circle. That was enough for Kara. For the next 2 weeks, while the world believed Elias Monroe had gone silent, he and Kara moved through the city like insurgents, part judge, part journalist, full rebellion. They traced a trail of money, one Langford had worked very hard to cover up. It began with campaign donations, bland, public, and unassuming. But from there, it twisted into shell corporations, real estate deals, and phony consulting contracts. Money laundering 101, if the stakes weren't so high. Elias mapped every account. Kara chased every name. One by one, the threads started to tangle, and they led to one place: Langford's personal holding company in the Caymans. It wasn't just corruption, it was deliberate. And then came the smoking gun. A whistleblower from inside East Dominion, terrified, anonymous, but fed up, sent Kara an encrypted file. She decrypted it in Elias's kitchen while he paced behind her. It was an internal company email, sent 2 weeks before the fires, between top-level executives and government liaisons. Subject: projections and land value opportunities, Silver Grove sector. Body: once the fires clear the way, the parcels drop in price. We move fast. Let the flames make room for investment. The room fell silent. Elias stopped pacing. The words echoed in the air like a gunshot. Let the flames make room for investment. They hadn't just ignored the warnings. They had welcomed the destruction. They had planned for it, counted on it, profited from it. Elias sat down, eyes fixed on the screen. His hands didn't shake. Not this time. I need to file a motion, he said quietly. A federal counter-petition. The document took him 3 sleepless nights to prepare. It wasn't just a plea to return to the bench. It was a legal counterstrike, a detailed breakdown of evidence, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and judicial sabotage. It included timelines, names, figures, and direct quotes. It argued not only for his reinstatement, but also for emergency injunctive relief to freeze East Dominion's assets and launch a federal inquiry into Langford's financial relationships. Elias Monroe wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was forcing the system to confront itself. He sent the motion at exactly 5:04 a.m., the timestamp matching the hour the first fire had been reported in Silver Grove. Then he waited. The media didn't cover it immediately. Langford's team tried to downplay it, called it a desperate act from a disgraced judge. But by then, Kara had already leaked the internal email to 3 independent outlets. The headline hit before noon. Judge suspended in Silver Grove case, uncovers shocking corporate plot behind fires. The internet ignited. Langford's PR team scrambled. East Dominion issued a statement calling the email inauthentic. But then a second whistleblower confirmed it, then a third. Then a fire analyst stepped forward with proof that power infrastructure had been intentionally overloaded. Within hours, public sentiment shifted like a storm. The same people who once doubted Elias now demanded his return. Kara's story reached 1 million views in a day. Someone spray-painted "Bring Back Monroe" across the courthouse wall. And for the first time since his suspension, Elias stepped outside his home without fear. Not as a victim, as a threat, but he wasn't done. He knew Langford would fight back. There would be more smears, more threats, more attempts to twist the narrative. But the difference now was momentum. Elias didn't just have truth on his side, he had the people. Inside the sealed courthouse, the gavel still waited. And this time, Elias wasn't just coming to finish the case. He was coming to burn the whole corrupt house down. The storm didn't break quietly. It exploded on live television. In a special midnight broadcast aired across national networks and streamed by millions online, Carolyn sat beneath bright studio lights with a folder in her lap and fury in her voice. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't hearsay. It was war. In the past 2 months, she began, her tone sharp as steel, the people of Silver Grove have been told that their suffering was a natural disaster, unforeseeable, unpreventable. Tonight, we proved that was a lie. The screen behind her came alive. Slide 1, a falsified safety inspection form, dated 3 weeks before the fires, bearing the forged signature of a state inspector who had died 6 months earlier. Slide 2, internal infrastructure maps, marked confidential, revealing the true state of Silver Grove's power grid. Decades out of code, rusted to the bone, with high-risk warnings that had been digitally removed in the publicly released versions. Slide 3, a payment ledger showing hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled from East Dominion's Community Support Initiative into political action committees aligned with Senator Patrick Langford, including one that paid for his luxury vacation just 10 days before the first spark. Kara paused. Her eyes burned. These weren't mistakes. They were strategies. The infrastructure wasn't neglected. It was sacrificed. And the people of Silver Grove weren't victims of fate. They were targets of profit. The line hit like a hammer. Phones buzzed across the nation. Hashtags surged. News anchors scrambled to reframe their previous narratives. The court of public opinion had just turned on its heel. But in Silver Grove, it turned into something more than noise. It became fire. By morning, the streets outside the state capitol building were flooded. People came by the thousands. Mothers holding scorched photographs. Grandfathers wearing oxygen masks. Teenagers with signs reading, "We remember the flames. Now you'll remember us." A single teddy bear, charred and stitched together, was placed on the building steps. Then another. Then 50. The toys lined the marble staircase like a silent cemetery of innocence lost. They chanted Elias Monroe's name. They shouted for Langford's arrest. They demanded accountability, not from a faceless system, but from the men who had watched their homes burn and smiled. For the first time since the smoke cleared, Silver Grove wasn't grieving. It was rising, and the system had no choice but to notice. The order came at 11:17 a.m., stamped and sealed from the Federal Court of Appeals. Elias Monroe was to be reinstated, temporarily, conditionally, to preside over the completion of the Silver Grove case. It wasn't a victory, it was a door. But Elias walked through it. He returned to the courthouse alone, coat flapping in the morning wind, walking past protesters, reporters, and federal agents. No motorcade, no entourage, just a man with a gavel and a mission. The courtroom doors creaked open like the gates of a tomb. Dust still lingered in the air. The overhead lights flickered on slowly, illuminating the bench that had been vacant for weeks. He stepped up to it like a warrior reclaiming his sword. And there it was, his gavel, polished, untouched, waiting. He sat, straightened his spine, and slammed it down. This court is back in session. Judge Elias Monroe sat high behind the bench, face carved from stone, black robes draped like armor across his shoulders. The gavel rested before him, untouched. He hadn't needed to use it. The room was already holding its breath. This wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about truth, raw, unfiltered, unforgiving. The prosecution had rested. The defense had squirmed. But now Elias did what no one expected. He opened the floor to the victims. One by one, they rose. One by one, they spoke. And with each testimony, another layer of Langford's polished facade cracked. The first was a schoolteacher, gray hair, shaky hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "We smelled the smoke during a math lesson," she said, staring into the middle distance. "I told the children it was nothing. Just a field fire," I said. "Stay calm." But then the windows melted. She stopped, took a breath. "There were 23 kids in my classroom. We got out, but my classroom didn't. Neither did their drawings, their books, their sense of safety." She turned toward the defense table. "He didn't just burn down a building. He burned their belief that the world would protect them." Langford didn't flinch, but the jury did. Next came an older man, wrinkled face, veteran's cap pulled low. He leaned on a cane, but his voice didn't waver. "I served 2 tours. Never cried a day in my life," he said. "But I cried when I found my wife's wedding dress in ashes." He stared at Langford. "Not because of the fire. Fires happen. But because it could have been stopped, and you let it burn." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elias didn't silence it. Some moments deserved to echo. A mother took the stand next. She carried a photograph of her son, 10 years old, smiling, 2 front teeth missing. "We were at the pharmacy when the flames reached our street," she said. "By the time we got back, it was gone. His room, his toys, his inhaler, all gone." She looked straight at Langford, her hands trembling. "My son died 2 weeks later. Smoke damage. Complications." Then softly, "He didn't die in the fire. He died in the aftermath. You didn't just burn our homes. You burned our future." Elias closed his eyes just for a moment. He didn't break, but he bled inside. And then came the line. The courtroom had already sunk into silence, deep, aching, charged. But it wasn't ready for what came next. A teenage girl took the stand. No lawyer prepped her, no speech written. She simply looked around the courtroom, then at Langford and said, "He didn't burn our houses. He burned our neighborhood, our school, our library, our memories." She paused. Then her voice hardened into steel. "He didn't just burn our past. He lit a match to our future." The courtroom froze. Even the reporters stopped typing. Langford's jaw twitched. It was the only thing that moved in the room. From his bench, Elias watched it all. Not as a judge, but as a man who knew what injustice looked like from the inside. He remembered the night his father was dragged away in cuffs, remembered how the system had looked away. Now it was looking right at Langford, and it was not blinking. Langford's defense team tried to object. "Your Honor, this is prejudicial." "Overruled," Elias said, voice flat and final. Let the people speak. They tried to stall, redirect, interrupt. Elias let none of it through. He gave the victims the floor, and they took it with fire in their throats. A local firefighter testified next. I filed 3 reports about faulty transformers. They were ignored. By whom? By corporate liaisons. By Langford's appointees. Every warning was buried. Did you feel pressure to stay quiet? He laughed, cold, bitter. I was told if I said one more word, I'd be reassigned to a desk until retirement. He looked at Elias. Your Honor, I didn't want to be a hero. I just didn't want to watch people burn. But they made me watch anyway. The courtroom was a powder keg, and Senator Patrick Langford lit the match. He rose from his seat with a sharp jerk, eyes wild, face flushed red with rage and panic. The tie that had once hung with calculated precision now dangled loose like the unraveling of a carefully controlled image. The gallery fell into stunned silence as he leaned forward, pointing a trembling finger at Judge Elias Monroe. You think you've won? He spat, his voice cracking with fury. You fools have no idea what you're playing with. I built this town. I built this state. Without me, you'd still be living in ashen tents. The room tensed. Bailiffs took cautious steps toward him, hands near their belts. Langford wasn't done. He turned to the gallery, eyes sweeping across the crowd like a wildfire. You'll regret this, he hissed. All of you. You'll crawl back to me. You'll beg. And when you do, when everything collapses, don't expect mercy. Then with venom so thick it made the walls seem colder, he turned back to Elias. And you, he growled, you're nothing but a token in a robe, a pawn dressed like a king. They put you up there so they could feel better about tearing me down. Gas shot through the gallery. Carolyn's hands flew to her keyboard. Reporters scrambled for cameras. The courtroom wasn't just watching history, they were inside it. But Elias Monroe didn't flinch. He sat still for a moment, absorbing every hateful syllable like a man watching a fire burn itself out. Then he stood slowly, deliberately, his presence commanding the room with nothing but silence and steady breath. Senator Langford, Elias said, voice low, voice cold. You have just committed contempt of court. Langford sneered. You can't. I can, Elias snapped, louder now, sharper. And I will. He raised his gavel. Bailiff, take him into custody. The gavel slammed down with the force of a thunderclap. The room erupted. Langford lunged as the bailiffs moved in, but they were faster. His wrists were grabbed, twisted, cuffed. He shouted, screamed, threatened. But it all dissolved under the cold click of steel locking around his arms. Don't touch me. I am a United States Senator. Elias stepped forward from the bench, descending like a judge from Olympus. And that title, he said, eyes burning, does not place you above the law. In fact, it makes your betrayal of it even more damning. Langford thrashed. This is a setup. I'll sue you. I'll bury you. But the courtroom didn't listen anymore, because the moment the senator's feet left the ground and he was dragged toward the holding chamber, the curtain of power fell, and behind it, just a man, corrupt, cornered, crumbling. The next hour unfolded like a storm breaking apart in slow motion. Elias called for a full evidentiary review in open court. Everything was laid bare. The fake inspection records, traced back to Langford's chief of staff, who had flipped the night before in a sealed deposition. The offshore accounts, cross-referenced with contractor kickbacks, each payment leading straight to Langford's re-election campaign fund. The whistleblower's testimony, corroborated by internal East Dominion Energy emails, including one damning message that read, "The fires will clear the market. The senator will handle the rest." And then came the final blow. A forensic tech from the Federal Cyber Crimes Division took the stand and confirmed, under oath, that evidence presented by Langford's legal team had been digitally altered, timestamps erased, signatures forged, metadata tampered with. Langford's legal team collapsed like dominoes. The court fell into a stunned silence as Elias picked up the final ruling. He read it slowly with surgical precision, each word a blade. This court finds Senator Patrick Langford guilty of obstruction of justice, contempt of court, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal negligence resulting in mass endangerment. He looked directly at Langford, now seated in shackles, eyes glassy, breathing shallow. For your actions, this court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison. No fanfare, no applause, just the hammering silence of accountability landing hard on Power's back. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had already begun to gather again. News of the ruling spread like wildfire, this time not one that destroyed, but one that cleansed. People cried, not out of pain, but out of relief. A group of survivors held hands beneath the courthouse steps. One woman clutched a copy of her denied insurance claim, now finally about to be honored. And in the center of the crowd, a boy stood quietly with a burned teddy bear in his hands. His eyes locked with Elias's as the judge stepped through the doors. And slowly the boy raised the bear high, like a gavel of his own. Elias didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just nodded, once. Because this wasn't the end of the story. This was the turning point. For years, Power had buried the truth beneath smoke, ash, and paperwork. But now the smoke had cleared, and the truth was standing tall, in a black robe with fire in his eyes and justice in his hands. Elias Monroe stepped down from the bench with the slow, deliberate movement of a man carrying the weight of generations on his shoulders. The gavel no longer in his hand, the robe still heavy on his back, he paused just before the final step, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. Once a battleground, now a monument. And that's when it happened. Not a cheer, not a shout, but silence, thick, breathless, holy silence, as every person in the gallery began to rise. One row, then another, then all of them. Men, women, children, survivors with scars, not just on skin, but in memory. Lawyers, reporters, clerks, the janitor with the limp, the single mother who lost everything, the boy with the burned teddy bear. Every last one of them stood, not in protest, not in grief, but in reverence. And then came the sound, not thunder, not noise, but a slow, rising wave of applause that hit like a heartbeat. Clap, 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 until the room was trembling under the rhythm of justice being honored. It was not the applause of celebration, it was the applause of survival. The courtroom had seen fire, literally and figuratively. It had seen lies, manipulation, intimidation. It had seen a man stripped of dignity, painted as biased, attacked for the color of his skin, the strength of his convictions, the clarity of his morality. And that man had not broken. Not when they dragged his name through headlines. Not when they threatened his family. Not when he sat alone at 3 a.m. reading fabricated accusations. Not when every hallway echoed with whispers. Not when the system he served told him to sit down, shut up, and let it go. He didn't. And now the people, his people, were standing. Elias's eyes landed on Caroline, the young reporter who had believed in him when even the law hadn't. Tears clung to her lashes, her notebook forgotten at her side. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He looked past her to the front row. There sat Sarah Jameson, holding her daughter in one arm and the scorched remains of her home's welcome sign in the other. Her eyes locked with Elias's, and she mouthed, "You gave us back our voice." In the corner, little Isaiah raised his teddy bear again, its one glass eye catching the light like a diamond. And that was when Elias finally exhaled. Not in victory, but in release. He stepped down the final step. The marble echoed beneath his feet. The applause grew louder, but he didn't acknowledge it with a wave or a smile. Instead, he walked straight toward the door. Not to escape, but to re-enter the world he had risked everything to change. Outside, the streets of Silver Grove were overflowing. The news had spread like a lightning strike. Langford sentenced. The empire collapsed. The truth revealed. Justice delivered. Not cleanly, not easily, but undeniably. Candles flickered along the courthouse steps. Signs lifted into the sky like prayer flags. Justice isn't bought here. Elias stood. So do we. Truth never burns. People didn't cheer for vengeance. They didn't dance for blood. They stood shoulder to shoulder for something far more rare: accountability. As Elias exited through the courthouse doors, the crowd parted like a sea. No barriers, no security, just people. One by one, they reached out, not to shake his hand, but simply to touch his sleeve, his arm, the edge of his robe, as if to say, "We remember. We see you. We won't forget." He kept walking, not because he wanted to leave, but because he knew something more important than justice had been planted here. Legacy. That night, Elias sat alone in his office, the robe folded neatly beside him, the gavel resting in its cradle. The lamp glowed soft and gold against the polished wood. In front of him lay the final document, a letter of thanks from the federal judiciary, a formal acknowledgement of the case's completion, a paragraph praising his integrity, his perseverance, his courage. But he didn't read it. His eyes drifted instead to the shelf where Isaiah's teddy bear now sat, its singed fur forever a reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. The clock ticked. Outside, Silver Grove slept soundly for the first time in months, and inside, Elias whispered the only words he could manage. "We didn't fix the system, but we proved it can't break everyone." He leaned back in the chair. Let the silence wrap around him. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of suppression, but the silence that follows when a war ends and the earth waits to grow something new. He had fought not just for justice, but to remind the world that even the most corrupted courtroom can still echo with truth when someone refuses to stay silent. And in that truth, Elias Monroe had found something greater than victory. He had found meaning, and meaning that lasts longer than fire, that cannot be stolen, that cannot be buried. It lives in the ashes, in the verdict, and in the hearts of the people who now knew. One man standing tall was enough to bring the empire to its knees. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The air in Silver Grove carried a different kind of weight now. Not smoke, not ash, but breath, clean, steady, filled with life and rebuilding. The sun spilled across streets that had once been lined with cinders. Hammers now echoed where silence once hung like a noose. And as Elias Monroe walked down Main Street, his shoes tapping on freshly paved concrete, he didn't see destruction anymore. He saw resurrection. The town was rising, home by home, brick by brick, frame by frame. Children played again, their laughter bouncing off half-built walls like an anthem. Shop fronts that had been blackened by fire now shimmered with fresh paint. Elias passed a bakery where the smell of rising dough drifted into the air. Where once there had been sirens, now there was cinnamon. But then came the moment that stopped him cold. A little girl, maybe 7, no older, stepped out from behind her mother's legs. Her dress was too big for her frame, her hands dirt-streaked from playing near a construction site. But her eyes, those eyes held galaxies of pain and wonder. She walked up to Elias slowly and held out something tiny, a beaded bracelet, handmade with melted plastic charms and mismatched colors. "This is for you," she whispered, her voice small but unshaking. "I'm not scared of fire anymore, because you didn't let it win." Elias bent to one knee, hands trembling as he accepted the gift. He looked at her, not as a judge, not as a symbol, but as a man who had once been a child just like her, who had watched the system crush someone he loved and had vowed never to let it happen again. "Thank you," he said softly, and as she smiled, he felt something shift inside him. Not release, not relief, but resolve. Because fire doesn't just destroy. Sometimes it forges. That evening, Carolyn stood before a national audience, her hands trembling only slightly as she accepted the National Investigative Journalism Award. Cameras flashed, screens glowed. Her story, the fire behind the silence, had swept the nation like a moral reckoning. Her reporting had torn the veil from systemic corruption. It had exposed the backdoor dealings between power and policy, had revealed how an entire community had been sacrificed on the altar of profit. Her name was now etched alongside those who had once brought down empires with nothing but truth and grit. But when she spoke, she didn't gloat. "I didn't win this for writing the truth," she said. "I won because someone else had the courage to stand in it." Judge Elias Monroe didn't just fight the system, he fought the silence we're all told to accept. And because of him, Silver Grove didn't just survive, it changed the country. The crowd erupted in applause. And watching from the back row, Elias didn't clap. He simply nodded once. Because validation doesn't always come in awards. Sometimes it comes in knowing the world finally heard what it tried so hard to ignore. Weeks later, Elias stood behind a podium at a legal ethics conference in Washington, D.C. The room was packed. Judges, clerks, law students, skeptics, believers. Cameras rolled, pens hovered, anticipation thickened. But when he spoke, he didn't speak like a judge. He spoke like a man who had lost something sacred and fought tooth and nail to get it back. "I want you to understand something," Elias said, his voice quiet but cutting through the room like a blade. "I didn't win because I'm strong. I didn't win because I'm smart. I didn't win because I had the law on my side. There were days the law was the first thing trying to break me." He paused. Let the silence soak in. "I won because I refused to be silent. That's it. That's all. I lost sleep. I lost friends. I lost safety. But I kept my voice. And in a world built on power, that was enough to bring it to its knees." He stepped back from the microphone, the room frozen, no one breathing. Then, just like in the courtroom, they stood. Row after row, legal scholars, lawmakers, activists, survivors. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need a gavel. Sometimes it just needs someone who refuses to shut up. As the night fell over Washington, Elias returned to his modest hotel room and placed the beaded bracelet on the desk beside his laptop. He stared at it for a long moment, not because it was pretty, but because it had weight, the weight of what had almost been lost. The truth, a town, a child's belief in good, all nearly gone, all now preserved. And yet he knew the fight wasn't over. Somewhere in another town, another boardroom, another courtroom, another Silver Grove was waiting, waiting for someone to speak, waiting for someone to burn without turning to ash, waiting for another Elias Monroe. But for tonight, in this room, with the hum of traffic outside and the silence of justice finally settling in his bones, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Not in exhaustion, but in peace, because the fire had come, and the fire had passed, and what remained was him, whole, unbroken, true, and that was enough. The courthouse was new, marble floors that hadn't yet been scuffed by years of footsteps, walls that still smelled faintly of paint and quiet promise. But for Elias Monroe, as he stepped across the threshold of the newly built courtroom, it wasn't the shine of the room that mattered. It was what it stood for. Reclamation. The old room, the one that had once echoed with lies, with threats, with whispered slurs about his skin and his integrity, was gone, burned down with the rest of the rot. And in its place stood this, a chamber born from ash, built by a town that refused to die. He walked slowly toward the bench, not with pomp, not with pride, but with purpose. In his hand he carried no gavel, just a small, charred object wrapped in cloth. He reached the judge's desk, paused, and then, with the care of a man placing a relic on an altar, he unwrapped the burned teddy bear. Its fur was half melted, its eye missing, its limbs stiff from smoke damage. But it stood, crooked, scarred, and still standing. Just like the town, just like Elias himself. He placed it on the bench beside his seat, right where it would remain, a reminder that justice was never about power, never about headlines, never about winning. It was about this bear, about the child who gave it to him with trembling hands and whispered, "I'm not afraid of fire anymore. Because of you." Elias sat down slowly. The leather of the chair creaked. Like it too, was taking a deep breath. His fingers brushed the bear one more time, not out of sentiment, but out of vow. Never forget why you began. Outside, the courthouse stood surrounded by a town reborn. But inside, in this sacred space, Elias Monroe took his place once more. Not just as a judge, but as a keeper of the fire. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that forges. the kind that burns corruption to the ground so that truth can rise. This may be where Elias's story settles. But across the world, there are still voices being silenced, families losing everything, and powers that think they're too big to be held accountable. That's why these stories matter. That's why you matter. If Elias Monroe's journey moved you, if you felt the fire in his fight and the truth in his silence, don't let this be the last courtroom you walk into. Hit like to stand with those who refuse to stay silent. Click subscribe to follow more stories that speak truth to power. And share this story, because somewhere out there, someone is still fighting to be heard. Justice begins with truth, and truth begins when someone refuses to look away.